Welcome back to the Mercy Cast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I am your host, Raleigh Sadler. Mental health topics, they're something that we talk about on a weekly basis on this podcast. And I think people listen because they're not exactly hearing it in the places where they want to hear it most. Oftentimes in our churches, it can be scary to address mental health topics. We may not feel qualified. We may not feel like we even understand, but this is a resource for Christians who are navigating life, who are recognizing that there are complexities that each of us face. Whether we are going through a good season or a bad, we are all in a season. We are all in transition in some form or facet. A perfect storm had been brewing for quite some time for Marilette. She dreamed of becoming a magazine writer, but then she met her husband. And then God called her and her husband to be missionaries. This was her first identity crisis. And as she was settling into being a missionary, they began having kids. Their family began growing. And then she realized that she couldn't even be a missionary now. So Marilette is sitting there thinking, God, what are you doing? What's happening in my life? I just figured this out. Now everything changed. Today, my guest is Marilette Sanchez. She is a New Yorker and a field director with Family Life. Marilette, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Thank you so much for having me, Raleigh.
So it seems like you had a couple of identity crises, one right after the other. How did you process that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first one you had mentioned in the intro was kind of giving up the dream of becoming a full-time writer, a journalist. That was the dream, to be a missionary. And I think it's funny, back then it seemed like the hardest thing to do, but now, like, having gone multiple identity crises, I'm like, that one wasn't that bad. But yeah, that was the first one I went through. Was I met my husband in college. We met at the King's College in Manhattan. And I was set to become a writer. God was opening doors, it seemed, for me to get these internships with like television production companies, marketing teams, and all these other things. So my major was politics, philosophy, economics, which sounds complicated, but it's just a liberal arts degree. And I had a concentration in media. So again, it felt like this is my dream. God's like, okay, here's the red carpet. That's at least what it felt like to me. And then I met my husband as I was volunteering with the high school ministry of Crew. Back then it was called Student Venture. So I wonder who would remember their Student Venture. But I would do these weekly kind of Christian Bible clubs at local high schools. And one was in Manhattan, one was in Brooklyn. And yeah, I was just able to reach high school students through the public school system and go to where they were, which is kind of what I liked. Like, a lot of times you expect people to come to church, but sometimes you got to go to them. And so that's what I loved about the high school ministry was we're going to where these kids are. My husband, his kind of track was be a volunteer coach, because under-resourced New York City public schools, like, yeah, we'll take all the help you can get. And then you build trust with the kind of the leaders, the faculty, and you're able to like get a room to do a Bible club. So it worked out. And there's actually, you'd be surprised, as long as it's after school, you could talk about God within the building. There's all these misconceptions about that, but I loved it. I feel like that was in school. I was learning what I wanted to do. I was getting these internships, and then kind of my free time, I was volunteering. And that's kind of how I saw it back then, was this very compartmentalized thing of here's my career path and here's where I get to like volunteer and serve God in ministry. Never in a million years would I have guessed that I would do vocational ministry. But the long story short, my husband was feeling the call to join Crew full time, and I did not feel it at all. But there had been a rule that has since changed, and it wasn't hard and fast rule, but we strongly recommend that if one of the spouses is going to join as a full-time missionary, the other one should join too, just because it's not a 9 to 5. It's not just like you check it at the door. Like you're done being a missionary. You're a missionary 24/7. Your evenings are going to go towards mentoring these kids, or the weekends, doing retreats. It wasn't like an hourly job. This is a calling. And my husband, he actually had kind of also a shift. Like he had a Jonah moment where he wanted to help high school students by being a teacher. And he did a year of teaching at a Christian school. But during that time, he felt the Lord call him. He's a couple years older than me, but he felt God redirect him. I know your heart is to reach these high school students, but it's not through teaching. I want you to do ministry full time. So he had gone through that kind of identity crisis and kind of turned towards ministry. I was not there, but we felt like we wanted to get married. So I was in this season of, I'm going to seek God. I'm going to get counsel. Should I do this? I'm going to have to give up my writing career to do this because, yeah, this is a totally different career path that was not on my radar. So, yeah, my husband felt called. I did not, but out of kind of obedience, like grudgingly, I did the application process to Crew. I was kind of like banking on, oh, I have all these hurdles because there's only a certain amount of debt that you can have as you become a missionary because you're just not going to make a lot of money, to be frank.
Right.
And then, so yeah, like I was like, well, there's probably these other hurdles that'll stop me, but I'll do the application process. And God just kept like, that's not a big deal. That hurdle is nothing. So like a whole other story there, but certain debts were forgiven because it was a private school and there wasn't a lot of like kind of government help, financial aid then. So I kind of was like, I know I'm supposed to be here, but God kept providing the way for me to be there. But I was still going to graduate with a lot of debt. And I was like, oh, this is my way out. There's no way I'm going to be able to become a missionary with this amount of debt. And he kind of was just like, our leadership took it on of like the Crew leadership of like, no, we're going to help raise money. Some of the debts were forgiven. And like, because the King's College is kind of, it was a ministry of Crew. Like when it restarted in Manhattan, Crew staff kind of helped start it. So yeah, all these things were like, I was banking on these doors closing because I didn't really want to join Crew in my heart of hearts. But God kept like opening the doors. And I was just like, dang, like I cannot, maybe that was my Jonah moment. I can't even run away now. Like he opened the door. So I get accepted into Crew. And I remember even in my application, I was like, this is my dream. I want to write. And I remember meeting with kind of the higher ups within the high school ministry. And they were kind of like, honestly, I don't see you not being able to do this within Crew. Crew is such a big entity that there's so many expressions of Crew that, yeah, why not? You can do some writing. I didn't really believe them, but I guess, yeah, that was God planting the seed of there's ways to do this. And so, yeah, we joined the high school ministry in 2012, full-time missionaries. And yeah, and then I get pregnant right away, honeymoon baby.
Tell me how deep this identity crisis went, because it sounds like you had a passion to do one thing, you get married, and then you use the word grudgingly decided to go into Crew. And even though there are opportunities where you could potentially write, it doesn't sound like you really even trusted them on that, because it sounds to me like, at least at that moment, you felt like you were being robbed of a dream and you were reeling in the aftermath. And so could you describe for us a little bit more, like, how did you know you were in an identity crisis, and did you know that you were in one?
I think I knew, like, even in that process of doing the application, I'm like, there's just going to be possibly I could write, but so under this might be too much information, but when you become a full-time missionary, specifically with Crew, now the IRS sees me as clergy. So there's certain things that I can't, there's certain like kind of income limitations I can't, like I always had dreams to like be an entrepreneur or just different things. Like I wanted to get my hands in everything, whether that's writing a book. And I just like now I realize there are Crew staff who write books, but back then I didn't know that. Like that wasn't advertised. You're a full-time missionary. Even before my time, when you joined Crew, you were assigned to a place. By the time I joined, they let you kind of go where your passion is, which was New York, which part of that reason is like nobody wants to come to New York because you got to raise a lot of support. But my husband and I are both native New Yorkers. So I already knew the dream as I was picturing it was not going to happen. Like there's no way. Because again, all these outside rules with the IRS and things like that, I'm like, there's no way. So my workaround was like starting my blog, at least get my creative outlet. But I really wasn't expecting much out of that. It was just kind of like me just keeping my gears turning of like my craft, but I really didn't have any. I kind of knew I was going to give that up to be a mom, to be a missionary, to be a homemaker. So we also decided to homeschool. So that's its own full-time job. So I was kind of like,
Right.
well, I guess I'll just do this well. I'm going to be the missionary wife. I'm going to be the homemaker. I'm going to be the mom. Like, because I have a value to be a good mom and be a present mom. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do all those things well. I really I really thought I wasn't going to write in any serious way.
So obviously, it sounds like there was a loss of a dream here, but it doesn't seem like that stopped you. You're navigating this crisis of identity. And rather than staying in the past, you decide to be present. You decide to focus on
Yes.
being a mother. You
Hmm.
decide to focus on being a homemaker.
Hmm.
Describe to me that shift. Did you find
Yeah.
peace in doing that? Kind of being where you were in that moment?
I definitely did not have peace because even saying that, those two things are different to me. And at least in my head back then, being a missionary means I'm going to go lead a Bible study with girls. Being a mom means I'm home with doing naps, doing like those two. Even if you set aside my writing thing, those two things were in tension, and I feel like I couldn't even balance those things. So that identity crisis was still there even at that moment because I'm like, well, the things that I was taught to do as a missionary that crew trained me to do, well, I can't even do that. So just a very like woe is me moment I was having of like, well, I'm here in the mundane and I can't even do that well. So I feel like that was a different level of the identity crisis of, okay, I set aside the writing thing. I honestly felt like it was a cold turkey thing. Like I'm literally not going to be able to write. But then I jumped into the missionary thing and then being, pregnant with a kid right away and then having kids close together. It was like, I can't even do the thing that I said yes to. Like I said yes to being a missionary, God, and then I can't even do that right because not to call it like house prison, but when the kids are young, you really are stuck in the house when it comes to nap time. And yeah, so my kids are all less than 2 years apart. We have 5 of them. And my oldest is 10 right now. My youngest is 5. So no multiples. So everybody's less than 2 years. There's one, number 3, number 4 are 14 months apart. So I'm just kind of now, I joke with my friends. I'm like, I feel like I'm an empty nester right now because my kids are out of diapers. Like that just literally became my whole life was being a mom. And again, I had given up on the writing, but even the missionary thing, I wasn't able to do it well. I felt like I was not doing that to my level of capability. Like
When did you
hindsight is 2020. I was able to do some discipleship, but back then I was like, I don't feel like I'm doing what I was trained to do. I feel like I'm failing at that.
At what point did you kind of embrace where you were?
Hmm. Yeah, I think when I had my second child, and I felt like, a mentor told me early on, who was also in ministry. She said, "Don't think of ministry life as like you'll ever get a balance. Ministry is not a balance; it's a blend." And that really stuck with me. So that's kind of where I started getting creative with, okay, I'm going to disciple girls at home. But even back then, I felt like that was the crumbs of it. Like I felt like there was more I could do. Like just that insufficient, the lie of insufficiency was always kind of rearing its ugly head in the back of my mind. But there did come a point where I was blogging at that point. I have this outlet, creative outlet. I also feel like I'm getting the hang of being a mom. Like it takes a while to turn off the other voices and be the mom that, mom being a parent out of your personality, that takes a long time. So probably around when I had 2 kids, maybe 3 kids, I was like, okay, this is a sweet spot. Again, but I think that was still a point where I hadn't thought of writing as a thing I had to keep up with. It kind of was just like a creative outlet, kind of low pressure. So I feel like that was a sweet point. But there was a time where I'm like, there was a balance. I was getting the hang of it then, but then I was getting this longing again to write. So I would say that was probably around when I had my 4th.
When you had your 4th?
Yes. And there's a blog post about that. So yeah,
And so you were
that was
really
a new identity crisis because I was just like, I wish I could turn off this longing to write and I can't.
so you were in this desert. You were kind of wandering around trying to figure out who you were, trying to figure out your purpose, trying to figure out what your place is in the world. And it wasn't a short amount of time. There are now 4 new humans involved. You have a husband involved. You're trying to be all things to all people and still do
Yes.
ministry and still hold fast to this integrity of wanting to be a writer, the thing that you trained for, the thing that you went to school for.
Hmm.
And you're sitting there in this kind of wasteland. And so you start at around your 4th child being born, things start to take a turn. Describe that for me.
So the pressure never came from my husband. He's always been my biggest cheerleader, specifically when it comes to like using my talents. So he was like, I'll take the kids, like you go right. But for me, it was I feel like a lot of moms can relate to this. It's the lingering mom guilt that no matter what you do, you feel like you should be doing something else. So like if you're at work, you feel like, oh, I gotta go, I shouldn't be here. I should be spending time with my kids. When you're with your kids, you're like, well, I could be doing some writing. So it's just there's always this, I'm sure dads experience it too. It's the what Paul talks about, your interests are divided. Like that was I felt that all the time. And I felt like I was doing everything not up to par. That's what it felt like. Like I was being jack of all trades, master at none. I would say most of my marriage life, my mom journey, I felt like that. Yeah. I think purpose was what I was lacking. Like, what is my purpose? Back when I was a college student, I had a one-track mind purpose. That's career. When I shifted to being a missionary, my purpose is to be a good missionary. It was all these like molds that I was artificially putting on myself. And that's what was burning me out. It's like, well, if I'm looking at it through the lens of this specific mold, whether that's a writer, that's a missionary, well, I'm not going to fit the box because I'm just so I'll speak specific to joining crew. There's a lot of moms who are homemakers and not a lot of people have like kind of outside careers. So this is going to be a generalization. I'm sure it's changed. But back then, at least what people portrayed was you're home, you're making the coffee for the Bible studies. And a lot of people are content. And I'm not trying to knock that. There's some people like that is their calling and they love it. They thrive in that. But that's kind of where my identity crisis came from. I didn't have a lot of people in my inner circle or even acquaintances that felt what I felt, which was I love being a mom. Don't get me wrong. It's so fun. And we homeschool and I get to spend a lot of quality time with them. But I have these outside aspirations and I don't know what to do with that. When I was just turning that voice off, it was simpler, but wasn't easier. I could just turn that off and I don't have to worry about that. But by the time I had my 4th, that longing, that what used to be a quiet voice that I was stuffing was coming out. Like it was just, there was nowhere to put it. I wanted to reach people through my writing.
So, how would you encourage our listeners who feel that their lives are not going according to plan? How they are now kind of in this monotonous grind sometimes
Mhm.
where you're just kind of doing the same thing
Yeah.
in and out, day in and day out. And it's not as exciting as the life that you pictured when you were younger, when you were like, this is what I'm going to do and this is what I'm going to college for.
Mhm.
How would you help them see where they can find purpose in the day to day?
I think purpose to me has shifted definitions as not a specific external output. Purpose now has been, how do I draw close to God, the abiding kind of theme of John 15. It's as simple as that. And then what is God calling me to do in that season, in that even that moment by moment, asking the Holy Spirit, what would you have me do? I think purpose is less with what I'm doing and more with what does my relationship with God look like? And also, and if I have that right, he's going to tell me what I got to do. And I think for me too, it's okay to not fit a mold. That took me forever to learn. I'm never going to fit a mold. In fact, I'm my own person.
And I would almost assume that because you have gone in this kind of twisted journey with these different turns here and
Yeah.
there where it didn't go according to plan, you can probably speak into people's lives who are similar, people who things didn't work out the way they expected. And
Mm.
so you can kind of point to this idea of you're more than your aptitude, you're more than
Yeah.
your goals, you're more than your dreams. You have worth as
Yes.
you are. And
Yeah.
you can find purpose and you can find identity in the here and now. And so
Mhm.
one of these people, if one of these people was coming to you and they said, Marilette, but I don't know. I feel like I just made a wreck of my life. I feel like a failure. I feel like everything that I've tried has gone the
Mhm.
opposite direction. What do I do? What would you say to them?
I would see if they could ask themselves to remember a time where you just felt joy, if that makes sense. I'm trying to get them to a point of like, vocation is separate from your career. So I wouldn't even know how to define vocation per se, but I think vocation, what do you call it? It goes kind of above career. Career is kind of an expression of vocation. And what God is calling, vocation equals calling. What God is calling me to do is more than just a specific thing. So I think for me, I'll just speak for myself to give an example. I was just talking to my husband about this, where I went on this solo retreat, which I was inspired by a book called Invitation to Retreat by Ruth Haley Barton. I took 2 nights away at a bed and breakfast, and I turned off all of my text messages, my notifications, and it was the purpose is to just solitude with God. And coming out of that retreat, I realized like my vocation is encouraging women in their identity with God. So there's going to be different expressions of that. There's going to be the writing, there's going to be the speaking, there's going to be the like one-on-one mentoring. There's going to be the I'm just modeling that and that's enough. That's going to inspire other women to do the same. And whether that's with I think for me I equated like joining crew, that's now my vocation, that's my identity. Crew is one of the many aspects of that vocation, that calling. Even like parenting could fit into that vocation. I'm showing my kids what is it to be a woman? What is it to be a wife? What is it to be a daughter of God? I have 3 daughters. By me existing that, I'm fulfilling that vocation. If I'm being authentic to myself for who God has called me to be, that's vocation. And it has nothing to do with what I'm quote unquote doing. It's existing, but it's being authentic to how God created me to be.
Yeah, and I think a healthy view of vocation could guide us as we are trying to navigate our identity crises. Because, yes, our identity
Mhm.
is often bound up in what we do, it's bound up
Yeah.
in our ministries, it's bound up in our vocation. But I remember a story where Martin Luther was asked by someone who had become a Christian. He said, well, now that I'm a Christian, what do I do? Like, how do I serve God? What does it look like? And he said, well, what do you do? He's like, I'm a cobbler. He goes, and this is a paraphrase, but well,
Mhm.
make shoes to the glory of God. And I love that idea of our vocation could be in what we are doing right now. So maybe our lives have not gone as planned, but maybe we're a parent. Being a parent, that is vocation right there.
Mhm.
Maybe you are working in a cubicle. That's vocation. Your vocation matters because I think it's in our vocation where we minister the most, where we
Mhm.
disciple, where we point people to Jesus, but it's where we live our lives. And
Mhm.
I think when we're out there looking for this grand vision of vocation, we often miss where God intersects with us on the daily. We miss where we intersect with our neighbors. And we could honestly change the world, but we change the world in such small ways sometimes that we are blind to it. And
It's
so,
true.
as you describe your identity crises, I don't hear them as much as you've done something wrong or anything. I hear these false views of what you think you can do for the kingdom are being stripped away. And
Yeah.
it's being stripped away to the basic you connecting with other people as you connect with God. Am I
Mhm.
close here? Am I on point? Am I off point?
Definitely. I want to read this quote from that book I was talking about, Invitation to Retreat. she talks about having a rule of life. So the author is called Ruth Haley Barton. And a rule of life are patterns of attitudes, practices, and behaviors we commit to with the purpose of keeping us open to the transforming presence of God. And so this is a question she wants her readers to ask to get to that point of knowing what that looks like. She asks, how do I want to live so I can be the person God created me to be and knows me to be, which is in the end who I want to be? A lot of times we look inward for our identity. We look inward for like, this is my calling or this is my purpose. You have to go to God for that because God's the one who created you. And as you draw near to God, I mean, it's a cliche verse, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and all these things will be added to you. If I go to God who created me, he's going to let me know what that looks like. And so many times it's not this formula that I want. It's not that I'm a missionary. It's not all the externals. You talked about the false self. Like none of that is me. And I remember going back, that's what I had to give up then was the thing that I thought was me was not me. The thing that I boiled myself down to was a writer. And that's why it hurt so bad to get that taken away from me because, yeah, that's where I put all my stock, all my hope instead of I'm a daughter of God. And if I had that view back then, I'm a daughter of God, like that one expression of vocation would not have wrecked me the way it did.
So, in a sense, your identity crises are actually showing you what your true identity is in.
Exactly. Just like that old illustration of like, how do you do a sculpture? You got to take out the things that are not, I forget do you know what I'm talking about? Like there's like an illustration of like, it was a sculptor. He's kind of like, somebody asked him like, well, how do you know, like, say he was sculpting an elephant. Like, how do you know how to sculpt the elephant? He said, that's easy. You just take out the parts that are not the elephant. Yeah. Like that's been my journey of God opening my eyes to the things that I was holding on to that are not really me.
But that sounds painful because it sounds like you're allowing this almost aspirational self to crumble so that you can see the revelation of the real self.
Yeah.
How do you survive that?
It's painful, but it's worth it in terms of I feel like I've gotten to know God in a more intimate way because of those identity crises, because I've made it out the other side of, well, I don't like, it's almost like I had to get to the point where like, God, I don't know what the outcome will be, but I do trust you and your character. So even though I say grudgingly when I joined Crew, I think I still in my heart of hearts knew like, okay, God is trustworthy. You know, it hurt. Like it really felt like a truck hit me, but like, I think in my heart of hearts, I knew God was going to figure it out, but it doesn't make it any easier in the moment. I'm not trying to sugarcoat that, and it's true. Like now my blog, so I don't know if you want to get into this, but when I was in 2017, I had one of my blog posts go viral. It was about Wonder Woman. And like people like Jefferson Bethke and Tim Lucas, who's in Jersey with Liquid Church, they reposted it. So like Jefferson Bethke reposted it and Tim Lucas did a whole sermon based on my points. Like he gave me credit. This was in 2017. So that was when I had my fourth. My fourth was a baby. And it was at the point where I was just like, oh, I guess, writing's still a hobby to me at this point. But then here comes this like kind of blow up of like, oh no, your writing is impacting people. And I was super confused. I was like, God, I thought I gave up writing. And then he kind of opened this door way open. I was like, oh, I'll figure it out when like the kids are, when I'm an empty nester, I'll get back to writing, like fully like trying to build that out. This is me still like doing it on the side. And then it blows up. So God kind of like humbled me of I could do what I want. Like whenever I'm ready, I'm going to open the doors. Like you don't get to tell me my timeline. So that kind of, yeah, that was 2017. So I wrote a movie review about Wonder Woman and it's about womanhood. So
it's interesting because we think that the things that take us away from the thing we originally want are shipwrecking our life, when in reality, it might be less us being pulled away from what we want and more us pulled in the direction of what we don't know we want yet. Because I think so much life is formative, right? A friend of mine yesterday said, he was telling me about a friend of his, and he goes, man, he has so many crazy stories. He has so many wild stories. So many things happen to him that don't happen to other people. He's kind of like you in that way. And I kind of laughed
I
because
love it.
I have so many stories because, yeah, some things did not work out the way they did. But man, I've got this tapestry of
Mm.
just random life occurrences that have made me into who I am. And I'm able to have a clear voice and speak into a gap. Like I honestly thought I was going to go into radio when I was 19 and then felt
Mm.
called into ministry and always wondered
Mm.
why am I not in radio? I wanted to be in radio. I got to be on a
Mhm.
couple of shows very early on when I was 19. And if you can find recordings of it, good on you because they're pretty terrible. But what's cool is I got to return to this. And
Yeah.
honestly, it felt like I was being led into this podcast world, even
Mm.
though I was trying to find a million reasons to not do it. And so
Yep.
I think that is the point that our crises of identity and our crises of faith that we experience may not be the thing that we think they are. They may not be God punishing us or us dealing with the result of our failures. They
Mm.
might be something that has come to liberate us, but we are so trapped in the lie of who we are that when we see our Savior coming in the door, we think it's a perpetrator. And so, how would you encourage people right now who are going through these crises of faith?
Trust in God as refiner. I don't hear that preached that often in a world of just like prosperity gospel and things like that. Like sometimes some things are spiritual attacks, but some things are a good father who wants to show us a better way and show us like where we're lacking or just like where we could grow in a thing. So I think for me, what looking back at all those like identity crisis, we kind of didn't even touch on my mental health journey in 2020, but like those crucibles, what I got out of those things was a more intimate, like God's presence. Like he takes out all the other external noise so I could just be with him. Like I look back and that was the common denominator. I came out with a more like experiential, not just intellectual view of God or just experience with God. Like as a friend, as a father, like and I can't even verbalize those things. It's just those moments in my prayer closet where I'm just like, God, I can't do this anymore. And he just gives me hope. Like I really can't even verbalize it, but just like, the another thing I've been through was like we're in a church transition and I felt like I went all in to try to build community there and it just didn't happen. And yeah, that wound is still kind of raw, but I look back those nights where I couldn't sleep and I was like, God, I can't do this anymore. Like I feel stifled. He's like, so I had the dream to have community at the church that he called me to and I never got it. And he's like, but you had me. And I would bawl because it's true. Like I never lost. I'm not even talking about faith crisis. Like I always felt his presence. I always felt like I could go to him in prayer and he would listen. And the more I do ministry, like in the city, I'm like, not everybody has that. Not everybody, even in the church, has that. And that's a gift. So all these, it's a desire that is true, a desire that is good to have community at your church. And I didn't get that and had to grieve that. But I never questioned God's presence. And that's such a gift.
So sometimes the cure is in the disease. The thing that we think is the bad thing is actually the gift bringing us back to the heart of God. I think this is such a
Mhm.
great reminder. And I know we set out to talk about mental health, and I think we did. But what I love about this conversation is it went a different way than either of us expected. But I think this is
Mhm.
what we needed to talk to today.
Yeah.
We needed to talk to this idea that if you're going through an identity crisis, that's not the end of your story. If anything, it's returning you back to the main idea. It's returning you back to your true purpose, even if you don't know what that is. Because I think we discover and we grow as we suffer. And that's the whole point of this podcast, learning The Art of Compassion, How to Love Other People Through the Adversity of Life. And as you have faced adversity in the form of these crises, they have brought you back to who you truly are. And I mean, that's worth the price of admission. It's not fun, but I feel like it's worth the price of admission. So, Marilette, thank you so much for joining the Mercy Cast.
Thank you for having me. This was a very refreshing conversation.